We are located on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish First Nations, and we thank them for their enduring custodianship of this land. A little bit to start out with about BRIMM and what we're trying to do here with this particular webinar and the launch of this program in Natural Capital and Biodiversity. So BRIMM is an institute at UBC that's designed to be interdisciplinary and to bring researchers together from across different parts of the university to work on big challenges in the mining sector. And one of those challenges facing the world today is how do we manage natural capital and how do we manage the relationship between natural capital, the environment, and mining, and that includes preserving biodiversity and enhancing biodiversity as much as we can. I was at a webinar last night, a panel, and one of the things that's inescapable when we talk about mining is it depletes natural capital. It's an extractive industry, but how can we actually regenerate the land once we're finished with it? How can we replenish the sources of capital, water, forests, land, and manage that as best we can in an extractive industry? So we have a very interesting panel of speakers today to sort of cover those issues. And I'll just ask them to briefly introduce themselves. So Orlando Rojas, going left to right on my screen.
Super. Thank you so much, John, for inviting. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the scientific director of the Bioproducts Institute, and here we have a lot of research and development going on as a cluster of about 40 professors and the researchers, including students and postdocs. This is related to the UBC commitment to transforming biomass into, especially with an increasing emphasis in the use of residues, biomass residues, into value-added materials for sustainable applications. And in a way, our mission is to promote the green bioeconomy by using strong research and developing positive impact in different sectors that can go from genomics, transportation, and building materials to healthcare. So what we want to do is to contribute to defossilization of the economy and to continue to better the quality of our lives, but that also means the life of the planet, thinking about a clean air, clean water, and a clean land. So this is in a nutshell what the Bioproducts Institute, cluster of research with those goals that are so important for UBC and for the province.
Thank you, Orlando. Thank you. And Sue Baldwin.
Hi, thanks, John. Thanks very much for organizing this webinar, and thanks to everybody for attending. So my name is Susan Baldwin, and I'm a professor in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering at the University of British Columbia. And my research area is in bioremediation, which is the use of microorganisms or biology to remediate mine sites. And I've been working in that area for close to 30 years now. And we've definitely seen in our industry, especially the chemical engineering industry, a huge pivot that's really picking up speed right now to move away from the old way of doing things into a very new way of doing things, and which is really important to the theme of this webinar. As John mentioned earlier, we do have this natural capital that we haven't really paid much attention to, and that's very much linked to biodiversity, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation around that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Excellent. And Greg Paradis.
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Paradis. I'm assistant professor in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC, and I am the theme leader for this new Natural Capital and Biodiversity theme inside of BRIMM. So I guess my background is in forest management as well as industrial engineering, and I try to connect dots, I guess, in my research program that haven't previously been connected. And so one of the dots we're trying to connect here is to ask the question, what if we connected planning activities for mining and forest sector extractive resource planning, could we achieve a more sustainable outcome than if those activities continue to operate independently of each other as they do now?
Thank you, Greg. And last but certainly not least, Gary.
Hi, everyone. So I'm in the same department as Greg, as a forest and conservation economist, and work with trying to find market-based solutions to environmental problems. And so I have been a professor there for the last 20 odd years, and before that worked for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in similar kinds of problems as I've been doing throughout my career, with this how to manage resource extraction and not have cause environmental harm. And I'll finally say I work a lot with Indigenous groups and Indigenous communities who are also looking for the same kind of solutions.
An excellent comment about the empowering Indigenous and First Nations communities to actually, economically benefit from the processes around natural capital management and biodiversity as well. Thank you, Gary. I might start with Greg, if I can. Greg, what does natural capital and biodiversity mean to you, and how does it connect to your research?
Yeah, so in my case, natural capital can be thought of as a framework for thinking about the flows of materials through these supply chains and their bigger impacts globally. So natural capital and biodiversity, again, are, I think, concepts that we can use as the connecting tissue to start talking about the stuff that I think is missing in this space, which is, are there or should there be interactions between the planning processes for the mineral extraction processes and the biomass extraction processes that we have for the forest sector?
Thank you, Greg. And Sue, what about you? What do you see as being prospects for this program of natural capital and biodiversity, and how does it connect to your research?
Thanks, John. Yeah, this is a pretty new concept that I think we've known about for a very long time. I've just come up with some new words for it. But natural capital and biodiversity are extremely important for the work that I do, which is, bioremediation of mine sites. Because first of all, we don't even know what biodiversity we have in these environments. So we've been doing a lot of projects studying the sort of microbiome of these mine sites and learning that most of the organisms that are there, we don't know nothing about them. So there's a biodiversity there we don't even understand. And this, mostly I'm talking about microorganisms that are sort of below the ground. And these are really important because even though they're so small, they are affecting the cycles, nutrient cycles, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the sulfur cycle. And these impact the quality of our air, of our water, of the soil, and even, the above ground biodiversity. And we don't even know it. So first of all, we need to sort of discover and understand what natural capital we have. It can both sort of, the results of what's happening out there can be both deleterious, but we can also learn from these natural processes and use that to develop maybe new biotechnologies or approaches, nature-based solutions that can really help preserve these environments and preserve the earth as we know it, as we want it to be in the future.
And Orlando, what are your thoughts on natural capital and biodiversity, and how does it relate to, how could it relate to mining, and how can the Bioproducts Institute contribute to this program?
Yeah, so first, I love the combination of these two words, natural and capital. It's amazing. And I wonder what is capital, and maybe Gary can explain that better, but to me, it's anything that confers value or benefits to an owner. And that begs the question, who is the owner of the capital, right? We all as a society, as a community. And if we monetize capital, then we can talk about assets that are used to produce goods or services, right? And what are those goods? What are those services? And then the other part of the combination of the two words, what is nature? So for me, in the Bioproducts Institute, in the work that we do, nature is related to plants, plant biomass that grows. And this is a basket of materials and energy as well that we can use. These are regenerative systems. Plants use the photobiosynthesis process to use sunlight, CO2, water to create the cell wall structure of trees. So this is an amazing opportunity. If we think about the regenerative biosphere, this is how I define the type of materials that we use, regenerative resources in the form of plants. So if we combine all together, natural capital and biodiversity is really an untapped economic and ecological potential that is in our hands. And depending how we use it, we can really make great contributions to the planet. So we work with global organizations in the Bioproducts Institute. There is huge interest in this area. And this really shows a shift in the mentality and in the priorities that companies and society are really putting on the table. There is a critical need to integrate those values that we have commented into, for instance, in our case, sustainable forest management and policy making. This is to support biodiversity and foster economic growth. This is a win-win if we can play the cards in the best way, but it's also very controversial. There are many different opinions, right? And I think we need to take scientific approaches to really make the best in a regenerative biosphere to advance technosphere that is circular.
Yes. That's a very important point there about the circular economy and making use of waste to feed it back into generative processes. So we might follow up on that one a little bit later. Thank you, Orlando. That's very, very insightful. Gary, your thoughts on natural capital and biodiversity, and your esteemed history of research and contributing to carbon markets and all of that work that you've done over the last few decades.
Yes. Yeah, so that's the challenge, right? Well, we got to boil it into 2 minutes. So so the thing that came to mind was what economists call the production function. So typically in economics, when you're producing goods and services, it's a combination of land, labor, and capital. So the natural capital could be equivalent to the land. And labor is human capital, and then finally the financial capital is the third part of being able to produce goods and services. So we have this. Of course, my passion has been certainly on the land and how do we integrate that natural capital in then to this mix as we produce goods and services. So I think that. Biodiversity, I don't know anybody in resource economics or environmental economics who wants to see a decline in biodiversity. However, it is measured. It is very complex to decide on how one measures it. But I'm sure that most of my panelists here, co-panelists, would also agree. There's nobody I know in our respective industries that wants to see a loss of biodiversity with the kinds of things we're trying to do as we extract resources. And so My particular interest is in the last while is to, of course, try and put a price then on these capital assets and value them in some way that the market would accept it. Because I don't believe regulations will ever get us to real solution spaces. It can help, but it's a combination of markets and regulations that need to work. And so I've been particularly interested in the carbon markets and how carbon markets can help with the climate change challenge. And but we could see now an emergence of biodiversity as another marketplace that is starting, but I think it will build on the principles that came out of starting and building a carbon market.
Yes, and yeah, the more companies are talking about biodiversity as something that can be transacted, sort of markets for preserving biodiversity as well. So trying to use economic mechanisms to manage natural capital and preserve natural capital is a really important part of what we're trying to do here, I think.
Yes, and I should say, John, finally, that so the mining sector has been involved for over 20 years now in trying to work on this. I was working with some South African mining companies back, and we had something called the BBOP program, and really, so this is not new to the mining sector. This is something that is, people have discussed for the last at least 2 decades about how to bring biodiversity into the mix.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much for that comment too. It's great to get your experience into this conversation. So if I could turn to you now, why do you think this program is important, and why is it relevant? Why do it now?
Yeah, well, I think that we're in several emergencies at the moment. So we have to do things. We have a climate emergency, we have food emergency, we have water emergency, we have security emergencies all going off all around us. And if I just talk specifically about, my discipline, I mean, we have to change, and we are, completely turning ourselves on our heads and pivoting in different directions, because we just can't continue. So, we have a legacy in chemical engineering of, making chemicals and, making chemicals that can do wonderful things. And so those chemicals, unfortunately, have wreaked a lot of harm on the environment. And so now we need to think differently. So, the reason we really need to, why it's so important as well, is for young people, for training young people, because today, the young engineers, or young people all over the world are, facing these dramatic situations. But they also represent, important human capital in themselves, because they are very interested and really motivated to do things differently. So, we have these opportunities that needs, fresh outlooks and enthusiasm, and so we have people at the ready. So we have people ready to get involved and start innovating. And the other thing that is that it's also important for industry themselves, because they are now, as Gary said, it's not terribly new. It's just that it's now an emergency. So a lot of the industries are they want to find out how to do this, how to preserve natural capital, how to preserve biodiversity. And they need help, actually, from academics, from us, from people at BRIMM, because there's so much that we don't know that we need to know, and we need to find out. We need to get all these young people working on finding solutions to these problems.
Thank you, Sue. We have some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, so please keep answering those, or keep giving us those comments. I might just direct one question from Chris Tucker to Gary. Hi, Chris. Good to see you last night at the event. Chris says carbon markets, while holding promise, have been fraught with false starts, frauds and failures. What confidence do we have that biodiversity markets will be any more effective? So I know, Gary, you've got a lot of experience and opinions on those questions.
Sure. So I agree it's been fraught with challenges, mainly because when you're trying to bring to market a new value, which is really what carbon tried to do, it's incredibly complex because everybody wants to get involved and everybody seems to be an expert, and that is a challenge. Also, the rules, of course, within different jurisdictions change. I'm not saying there's, but the markets themselves have solutions. It's just a matter of all the complexity of the environment, the regulatory environment, and the aspirations of people to turn it into something that's kind of unrealistic. The same thing could happen with biodiversity, but I do know people are making a lot of attempts to try and bring biodiversity to market. I think it's early days for biodiversity, and I think they could learn a lot from how the carbon market is developing. 2023 was a very rough year, but we're seeing a huge uptick in 2024 in terms of the carbon market stabilizing. So I still remain optimistic that we can put value on these kinds of ecological services in nature, and that we can use market mechanisms to allow for more efficient solutions coming from resource sectors like the forest sector and the mining sector.
Thank you, Gary. I've got another question here from Claudio Arato. Hi, Claudio. So the question I might direct to Sue. How does this initiative connect natural capital with social license? So obviously there's a close connection here between when we want to talk about social license to operate, which is a big issue for the mining sector and resource sectors more generally. Claudio says mining cannot happen without people wanting to learn and participate in solutions, and First Nations need to engage meaningfully. Sue, would you like to tackle that one about the connection between natural capital and the social license to operate?
Sure. Hi, Claudio. How are you doing? Great that you attending our webinar today. Yes, so I think I guess as engineers, we've always just thought about technical solutions, right? We're kind of geeky that way. But you're right, it's really people need to be engaged and willing and enthusiastic. And so we're definitely working more with Indigenous communities in most of the projects. We do actually have a lot of, at UBC, sort of training for us and for students to work with Indigenous communities. We are also we're inventing new courses about humanitarian engineering. So we really are trying to bring that human component into our work when we think about solutions, not just trying to come up with the latest and greatest technology. And it is, as you know, it's really difficult to engage with different stakeholders. You've got, mining companies, environmental groups, First Nations, communities, and so on. And, I'm teaching a new course. We've got a new program here that we started, environmental engineering. And we start teaching our students about this in second year. We start introducing them to this concept of stakeholders and people and how we can work better with them. So yeah, I was well aware of it when, we're trying, and it's a new field for us as engineers, but it's certainly very, very rewarding to keep that top of mind.
Thank you, Sue. Would anyone else like to comment on the connection between social license to operate and natural capital? I think it's a really interesting connection.
I have a brief comment. I just want to say that that concept, I think, is fundamental to part of the inspiration for creating this new theme, is recognizing that participatory planning in natural resource industry is becoming more and more of an important part of the process of planning. And when you have multiple stakeholders coming together with divergent and sometimes difficult to reconcile points of view, it's really important to give everybody's voice the space it needs in the process. But we don't have a lot of obvious solutions to meaningfully and equitably engaged with multiple stakeholders. We're still working it out. So I guess that's part of what this theme is looking to figure out. And my clue of how we're going to approach that is by making sure that everything we do is transparent and reproducible and improve accessibility of some of the science that we're doing, so that we can bring more people into the conversation instead of excluding them. So I don't have all the answers, but I guess those questions are fundamental motivators for creating this research theme.
Thank you, Greg. Orlando, I might ask you about your opinion on why this research theme is so important, and why now. Why do we need to be paying attention to this, and what are the possibilities?
Well, there are many aspects, right? One is resource sufficiency. We better make good use of the resources that we have. And that means that we need to preserve them and use them in a circular and regenerative fashion, as we alluded before. So that's very important. So in my mind, representing the Bioproducts Institute, what I tend to say always is that we're trying to transform a hydrocarbon-based economy into a sugar economy based on carbohydrates, right? So these are materials that are environmentally friendly, can be used to substitute the materials that today we use and we know are harmful to the environment. So this is very important. We're looking into transition to industries that are seeking greener alternatives. So it's a question of substitution. And there is no way out. We need to use materials that are provided to us by nature, but we need to take care of nature. So in the BPI, in the Bioproducts Institute, we have really a great cluster of research, as I introduced at the very beginning. And definitely what we are looking is into reduce our reliance to non-renewable resources, and of course, decrease the greenhouse effects. And this aligns very well with this theme. And what we do in research is really with that, with those goals in mind, right? So very important in all that we do, and we put in place to replace the materials that we currently use. And that's a big shift. Because it starts with educating people and educating the government and decision makers. As I communicate with people, I realize that there is a lot of misconceptions, and we need to establish a conversation, a dialogue to find solutions that needs to rely on nature, because otherwise we will continue doing all as the same. We will keep the status quo, and that's not possible. But that requires the issues that Gary and my colleagues have mentioned, right? There are economic, social impacts that are really very important and should be at the forefront. So in the BPI, we have that type of very multidisciplinary research where we look into forest products, plants, residues utilization, combined with economic and social cross-cutting subjects.
Thank you, Orlando, and that nicely touches on Salah Gautam's comment or question about how do we increase awareness of these opportunities, regarding nature-based solutions. So, Orlando, do you have any particular thoughts on how we can do that?
Well, we have the responsibility, BRIMMs, the BPI, to communicate, put channels out, to educate, and to establish communication channels, as we are doing now in this panel discussion, right? Because then we can make decisions. People can really understand and learn. And that really needs to reach out, again, the government, because in the decision-making, there is a little bit of, we're missing many factors that are so important and will be more important in the future. So you know, the first answer is communicating. We need to establish communications, education, training, and learning together, because these are very complex problems and require different facets and influence from many actors. They all need to be around the table.
Yes, yes, agreed. It's got to be a network solution with networks of stakeholders working together. Yeah. I have another question in the chat from Sugu Turaisami. I hope I said that correctly. Sugu was saying, you know, we always recognise the custodianship of the land and the water and the other natural features of the environment, you know, that belongs to the First Nations. But when we start to turn this into an asset class, who should own this capital? And he says, Sugu, I assume he or she, without having this sorted out, you cannot get the capital to fund the engagement processes which are required to determine the sustainability plan or compromise on who owns what piece of the natural capital. So I might turn that over to Gary. You know, how do we think about sovereignty of this natural capital, and when natural capital is created by you know, creating biodiversity markets or carbon markets?
So it's a good question, Sugu. Thank you. You know, we do. The good news is, in Canada, at least, I think we have some real initiatives that are leading that I think we can lean on and learn from with First Nations and Indigenous groups in this space. We're seeing a lot of work with the First Nations. There's a Climate Action Coalition. There's a First Nations, other coalitions as well with First Nations and traditional businesses. There's an Indigenous research network. There is a business development group with Indigenous groups and working with many sectors. So there's a whole suite of things happening across Canada that will help us tackle this question, I believe, around who owns the natural capital. I mean, in many cases, it's going to be some sort of shared arrangement, right? It's going to be a benefit sharing agreement or some other type of arrangement that we've seen. And I think, frankly, Canada has been a world leader in trying to tackle that challenge. And this is what my colleagues globally tell me. And so the other thing I wanted to say is that really the interesting thing of bringing the Indigenous voice to the table is they look at land, they do not compartmentalize it the way we do between forests and mining and water and so on, that they look at land in a very holistic sense. So if we're going to go forward, extracting resources in some fashion, then we need to do it in some sort of collective way and manage it with Indigenous groups. And I think that's quite exciting because it will help break down some of the silos that we've seen between sectors, particularly in Canada over the last 30, 40 years. And I think it's time, and I think that's a great reason for this initiative to be launched is to help us create the dialogue between sectors to find solutions that also will work for Indigenous groups who take a much more holistic view.
Thank you, Gary. And there's another question there from David Elstone that touches on that as well. We'll get to that in a minute. Greg, there's a really interesting question here from Yan Kun Yan. And Yan Kun is asking about forest reforestation, restoration after mining activities. So he's asking, and I know you're working on a program for Rio Tinto about this very topic at the moment. So can you provide some examples of specific biodiversity conservation initiatives that have been successfully implemented in areas affected by mining?
Yeah, I guess I want to preface this by saying that what I do know about the rehabilitation and restoration of ecosystems after mining is that it's very much a case-by-case basis type of science and professional practice. And that's the fundamental thing that can't be ignored. The generalities that can be applied, though, are to collect data on historically what was there before the mining impacted the area, but also consider the surrounding areas to see what is it that the communities that are currently on the land want from a rehabilitated piece of land, which may diverge from what was historically there. And then to take, I guess, a holistic view and try and merge those ideas together and make an actionable and feasible plan that's well-funded to gradually, I guess, begin restoring generally the mix of plants and wildlife and biotic and abiotic elements that were there pre-disturbance. However, it's almost never the optimal solution to try to get exactly back to what things were before. It's almost always what we're looking for is some new thing that's never been there before, but that integrates some of the old and some of the new. So hopefully that was specific enough, but the world is such a big place that there are a squillion different mines in a squillion different ecosystems that all need their own tailor-made solution to restore them after impact.
And I know that our course that we're putting together, which will launch in August, will include some detailed case studies on restoration and different ways of restoring and advancing biodiversity around mine sites. So please go to the BRIMM website if you want like more information about that particular course. I might throw this one over to Gary again. It's from David Elstone. So Orlando mentioned that we all own the natural capital. In British Columbia, where 95% of the land is owned by the Crown, just getting the question up again.
It's already answered.
That's already answered?
Click on the answered tab and scroll to the bottom and you'll find your disappeared question.
Yep. Thanks. Here we are. So the recognition of Aboriginal title to land adds a unique layer to attempting to understand the equity ownership of the capital. Are there jurisdictions that will advance natural capital values faster than others? How do we make it work here in BC? So it's sort of similar to the previous question, Gary, but with a sort of a slightly different angle to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say quickly that New Zealand has had a lot of very positive experience working with the Maori and trying to reconcile, resource use like forestry with the Maori communities. And in fact, the Maoris are very, very active and invested in the forest sector in New Zealand. So they also have been one of the unique jurisdictions to bring in an emissions trading system, to bring carbon into the mix of how you're going to manage forest plantation. And the Maori have also made it part of their mission to convert from single species plantations into mixed species, native species. So there's a lot going on in New Zealand that I think one could learn a lot from in BC. And I will call out one company that I've been working with over the years that I think has been very innovative at trying to get through this blockage that we're currently seeing in BC and scaling up. I would say there's lots of things happening in British Columbia, but it's like, how do we scale it up and get it faster, I think is the big issue, because right now we're seeing planning processes that could take another 10, 20 years before they actually get through to a result. And Greg would know a lot about that. And so I would say New Forest is a Australian company started in Australia, works in Africa, in Central Asia, in the United States, Canada, not so much, but they have been very innovative at working out business relationships with indigenous communities and including carbon into the mix. And so I see them as it's now an $11 billion company, started in 2005, but they are going to investors with a very different business model, and investors like it. So I do think there are reasons for hope, but we do need to change the dialogue at the provincial level, certainly at the federal level as well, in order to accommodate some new ideas in terms of how we manage land.
Thank you, Gary. Greg, I have okay, Orlando, you put your hand up there.
Yes, super. Thank you, John. And Gary, yeah, super good. I mean, this is so important what you brought up. And one thing that I wanted to add is that we are taking baby steps, I would say, in the province. If you look into the Ministry of Forests, they have indigenous initiative that I think are going along the lines that Gary indicated, right? And I can narrate or I can share with you some experiences, very small, but nevertheless, I think they are in the right direction, right? For instance, small units that use resources locally for the local benefit. I think we need to see more of this type of small enterprises that can be agile and can really bring value to the local community. And there are great opportunities, for instance, in the production from forest resources and residues of insulation materials for building and construction. There is a startup related to that topic. There is also something that we do in the BioProducts Institute that also interfaces with mining. And this is the case of the use of residual bark, a residue that contains very interesting molecules that can be used to clean water. And the indigenous communities know how to use this best. So that's at the intersection of the knowledge, the original knowledge, and what we can do, again, with a little bit of a mentality of the entrepreneurship that brings economic value to the community. And finally, one comment is if we think about the Canadian context, that the forest lands are mostly owned by the Crown, more and more going to the indigenous communities. This is a little bit different than what we see in the Nordic countries where there are private owners. In those cases where you have private ownership, you can make better use of the land. And what is different that I see, maybe Gary and Gregory can correct me, is that here we have a lot of residues that in other jurisdictions are fully utilized. So we can do better here. And that's a great opportunity for better using the land.
Thank you, Orlando. Some great comments there. We have more questions, which is fantastic. Keep them coming. It's the whole point of this is to be interactive. So question in BC, and I might direct this to Greg if I can. It appears that fibre security is driving mill closures. How can the forest sector begin to incorporate biodiversity risk into its decision-making when the sector appears to be in economic peril? And will BRIMM focus on policy solutions for integrative planning? I assume by integrative, we're talking about integrative between sectors like mining and forestry and other sectors.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the back half of that question. And I would say that very much that notion of integration of planning processes is going to be at the core of our lines of inquiry with this new BRIMM theme. And it won't just be integration of forest and mining sector activities. It'll also be, for example, integration and coordination of decision-making across, say, government industry boundaries, where in British Columbia, as David Elstone pointed out, well over 95% of the forest managed land is public. And so there's very much a distributed decision-making environment where multiple stakeholders are all making part of the decision and aren't necessarily coordinating those decisions in the most sustainable way. And yes, I totally agree with your reading of the tea leaves that the fiber supply in British Columbia is very much driving the bus in terms of decision-making right now. And I don't think that's the best possible driver for this bus. I think what we need to do is set up through what Gary was saying earlier, with a combination of policy constraints and regulation, but also incentives with market forces, new levers that drive this bus in a way that naturally points it in a more sustainable direction than just sort of playing last man standing games with old mills that are trying to keep their nose above the water in a dwindling fiber supply environment with increasing costs and such. So I think there is a lot of potential in this solution space, but we're going to need to get creative, and continuing to do exactly what we've been doing in the past is not the sustainable way forward, I don't think.
Thanks, Greg. Sue, I might direct the next question to you, because I know you're very interested in the intersection between forestry and mining and the possibility of circular economy ideas between these two sectors. So question is from Yan Kun Yan. What do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for achieving sustainability in the intersection of forestry and mining in the next decade? And are there international best practices that could be adopted and adapted for here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yes, we are working here to sort of increase the interaction between forestry and mining, particularly around residues, as Orlando talked about residues. And because residues were, seen more as a liability in the past and are now becoming a value. And that sort of changes the dynamics a bit. So, when you have residues, then you're just kind of happy to get rid of them and give them to anybody who would take them. But, and then, that's if somebody else can take the residue from you that's costing you money and then do something useful with it, that seems to make everybody feel good. But I think the big challenge is now is, because these are seen as values, and I know there was discussions before about ownership, and so that I think that's a challenge for achieving sustainability. Like if we can see ways of doing it, it's complicated technically, and circular economies can be expensive. But then there's also all these issues of who owns what, even the microorganisms that we've been studying on mine sites. Now somebody owns them. And so, I mean, that's just a personal concern of mine. I see technical challenges to achieve sustainability, but everyone's doing life cycle assessments to really mass balances. That's a kind of core to the chemical and biological engineering discipline. We need to calculate, where does the carbon go? Where does this go? So people are doing life cycle assessments to do that, so they can look at balancing resources. But it's complicated. There's so many different processes that need to be implemented, and they need to be implemented cheaply. So it's what we would call, and what we're calling in our business, as wicked problems. So we've got this word kind of wicked, which systemic problems, or they're so challenging you have no idea how to tackle them or do them, but we've got to think about it. So I like what Orlando said earlier, which is baby steps. At least we know we have to do it, and we're just taking baby steps towards trying.
Thank you, Sue. Maybe you could mention the biochar project, as an example of waste to value. So waste from forest being used as for value in mining, and getting positive biodiversity and environmental outcomes at the same time. Yeah, as John mentioned, this is a really great project that we have going on in our department amongst many different groups. Is this idea of, it started out as a sort of idea of an energy hub, that you would take residues
from organic wet residues from wherever they were not being utilized, and then turn them into first of all, it was energy to turn them into sort of biofuels through gasification or chemical processes that we're familiar with that can generate different chemical compounds from lignocellulose waste that were first energy compounds, and with a residue called biochar. But this residue biochar is becoming of great interest, and it's basically just the carbon that's left over after processing of these wastes. And biochar has very many properties that are beneficial to biodiversity. People use it to increase the quality of soils. You mix it into soils, and the biochar can actually retain nutrients in the soil, can help beneficial microorganisms to grow, can increase the productivity of crops, and so on. And actually, biochar can also be used for water treatment. It can be used to remove emerging contaminants from water. It can also be considered as a form of carbon that gets kind of buried in the ground. And the organic residues, I think one part of the group started working on clothing. So there's a lot of waste clothing around. And so this too we can use these traditional chemical engineering processes to, create maybe biofuels, renewable natural gas, and also, biochar. So this is that we're all actively working on this project, several of us in the department.
Thank you, Sue. I have a question here from Jason Aboud. Jason, good to see you again. We go back a long way with the MMAP project, and you'll be pleased to know that that's another great example of collaboration between organisations to launch a new company, and particularly one that's involved in bioremediation of mine sites. But Jason asks how, and I might ask you to clarify TNFD. Does anyone on the panel know TNFD? Jason, could you type that out? So the question is, how do you think we can motivate mining companies to work towards nature positivity now without any direct financial benefit to them? A really good question. I know tech is making big commitments to biodiversity and being nature positive and conservation of land. So Jason writes, I'm curious to see how the mining companies will take to TNFD as for reporting as a starting point. I might need a clarification of TNFD there. But what does the panel think about what might motivate mining companies to work towards nature positivity without any obvious financial benefit? And I guess another question is, could there be markets for these things where there is a financial benefit?
Well, I think there's two things that we've already mentioned, John, in this webinar. And one of them is one of the participants asked about social acceptability and license to operate. So I think that's a big part of the answer that I would give at this point to that is what would motivate big companies. And it's not just mining companies. It could be oil and gas companies. It could be big telecom companies that have massive emissions. Anybody who's basically currently has a profitable and extractive presence on the landscape and feels like maybe they're not giving back as much as they ought to have would want to ramp up their initiatives preemptively in terms of improving biodiversity, adding services to the communities that they impact to gain social license to operate. And I think this could be a competitive, decisive factor in who has the pole position in terms of several markets in the future, including mining. So that's part of it. The other part of it is, mining and some of the world's biggest mining companies have recently declared voluntary net zero carbon emissions goals for various reasons. And they've also, some of them declared natural capital accounting or triple bottom line type accounting, which is going to require them to, through their voluntary commitments, start tracking not only financial performance, but social and ecosystem performance. And so they're going to have to reflect on what is good performance versus bad performance, and assuming that they find that some of their indicators are not up as high as they'd like them to, start coming up with actionable strategies to get there. So I think a lot of the conditions we need for those actors to spontaneously engage in these activities without needing a financial profit motivator are already there, but I don't think all of those connections have been made already. And part of what we're trying to do here is to map out those missing bits and see if we can provide the missing links.
Thank you, Greg. And we do have some comments in the chat on TNFD. Thank you. Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and Claudio's kindly put in a web link, www.tnfd.global. So thank you for that. We've come to the top of the hour, so that's gone really quickly. I had a list of questions, but it's the questions that have come in from the audience, which have been fantastic. I do apologise if we haven't been able to get to all of your questions, but thank you for the engagement. I'd just like to thank our panelists today. Very busy people, real experts in the field, and really appreciate your input today, and also Dana and Bernadette for coordinating and managing. And we congratulate Greg on this new theme and the leadership team, and we hope to see great things in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.